He went e4. Here I decided to stick with my prep and I played e5. I decided just to keep it super solid. Knight f3, knight c6, and he goes for the Italian game. Bishop c5, c3, knight f6, d3, d6. There's a lot of different ways for black to play. Does anyone in the chat, do you guys play this for either color, white or black? Strong Chess says, I play King's Gambit, but considering switching to this as white. Yeah, a lot of people, they start with the sharp stuff, the Joko Piano, the Scotch Gambit, the King's Gambit, and then they switch to something more steady. I think this line, it's not so sharp, but it does carry a ton of strategic danger for black. So definitely remains, hugely playable. Let's see, Ready Car says he plays h6 here. Yeah, h6 is definitely one of the main moves, just stopping bishop g5 for the long term. d6 and a6 are also very possible. Hey, Gravelly Pawn, good to see you. Triumphant says, I do Joko Piano. JD says Sicilian Khan. I like the Khan. Khan is an interesting line as well. Okay, so yeah, there's a few players playing this. Well, I play with d6. Castles is also possible with the idea of pushing a very quick d5. But I've always liked this kind of structure for black. So castles h6, and here Melik played a4. This has of course become the big main line in this opening nowadays, where white's idea is not just to threaten to trap the bishop with b4 a5, but also to just gain space on the queen side in general terms. And this is always just useful in the long run because you always get this pressure with a potential b4, b5. So it can be kind of unpleasant for black. a5 is a very reasonable move here, just stopping b4. I think Ding Liren likes this a lot. He just plays a5 in every position. In my opinion, it's perfectly reasonable. a6 is also playable. I'm more familiar with this structure with a6 and not so much with a5, so that's what I went with. Knight bd2, castles, rook e1, bishop a7, knight f1. All this stuff is very normal. I would say what's interesting though is that white has not played h3, and he's kind of saved the tempo on this. And I think the point is that he's never really worried about knight g4 because he always just goes rook e2 and then h3 next, and the knight on g4 is just going to have to go back. There's a lot of different setups here for black, like knight e7, knight g6 is also considered a very viable plan in these types of positions. But I just went with like the solid stuff, just the classic rook e8, knight g3, bishop e6. And I'm not too booked up on the theory here, but I'm familiar with some ideas that the black is playing for, so I felt comfortable. Bishop takes e6, rook takes e6. fe6 is also very possible. Positionally, this move, I would say, is double-edged because you're taking control of some extremely important squares, f5 and d5, especially with white's knight on g3. But the drawback, of course, is that the double pawns in the long run can be weak. And I think when white plays d4 here, these positions can be somewhat shaky for black. White can also play like b4, and then put the queen on b3, push b5 at some point, maybe bishop e3, d4. It's a little iffy. I'm not sure about this stuff. So I decided to play rook takes e6, which I think is actually interesting because on one hand, it feels like black is just giving up the f5 square, but white cannot really use this square so easily. I mean, you can put the knight on f5, but what black does here very often is black just puts the king on h7, and then there's a pretty typical plan here to drop the knight back to g8, covering the h6 pawn, and then playing g6 and kicking the knight out of f5. And if black knows this plan, then usually this early knight f5 stuff is actually not that dangerous. And then white just has to go back, the pawn on g6 is solid, and black is usually doing well. The other idea is just to immediately play d5. this is kind of black's main counterplay in the position. So you just push d5, you put some pressure on the e4 pawn, immediately we're threatening to take, trade queens, and take on e4. And then from here, black tries to build up queen d7, rook a d8, takes on e4, tries to get the queen into d3, and black gets some very reasonable counterplay in the center here. I'm not sure objectively this is playable in this position, but usually this is the idea for black. It seems like this is okay. Although I think king h7 might be more solid move. Engine doesn't really know what to make of it. Okay, it kind of likes d5, which makes sense. It likes the concrete stuff. The move I was mainly expecting, I think, was b4. This is kind of the theoretical move, and here again black just plays for d5, and objectively I think black is doing okay here because we're just getting enough counterplay in the center. But Melik plays a super interesting move, one that I was not expecting at all, c4, which is, I mean, you know, as positionally double-edged as it gets, because like white just gets this super grip on d5, and doesn't let black break with d5, but on the same hand, or on the other hand, just gives up the d4 square. But strategically it does make sense because this square can still be attacked by white's bishop. You know, it's a dark square, whereas I don't have a light squared bishop to fight for these squares on f5 and d5. So strategically white is kind of doing something very interesting, but he is giving up a lot of squares in his own position as well. Okay, after analyzing the game, I realized that I think black should just play a5 immediately, just fixing the b4 square and eventually planning the plan of knight b4 and maybe c6, maybe even breaking with d5 one day anyways. If black could get this in, then I think black would just be equalizing, at least. But for some reason I decided to play king h7 first. I think maybe I was overly concerned about the knight coming to f5, but again, when white does this, I don't have this d5 break, but I can still revert to the plan with knight g8 and g6. And usually this is pretty safe for black. I'll kick the knight out, then my knight will get back into the game, and then I can come back with this plan of a5, knight b4, and so on. Pawn Grubber asked, is knight b4 immediately worse than a5? Yeah, good question, and I think it is. For a very specific reason, in that, you know, white can just play a5 himself. So after knight b4, I imagine white goes a5 here, and then we don't get a5, and then this knight is going to be chased away. Maybe not bishop d2 because we're hanging the pawn, but okay, queen b3 or rook a4, or maybe we defend the pawn first with some move, and then bishop comes to d2 anyway. So this would be the problem. And that's why black should just immediately play a5 in this position, just to immediately fix the square. Because after what I did, king h7, I think white missed an opportunity here to play a5 immediately. Actually, we talked about this just briefly after the game. Melik just mentioned, oh yeah, he should have played a5 earlier, before I got a chance to. But of course, I also should have played a5. And the point is, it's just kind of fixing a little bit more space on the queen side. And I don't think white has a huge advantage here, but it is unpleasant now for black because I don't really ever want to play b6 here and open things up this way. But then I'm not getting the counterplay. The knight on c6 is just going to get traded off on d4. And then it's not so clear exactly how I'm going to be able to create counterplay in the position. Maybe I can go knight to e7, but then it's always awkward to do this with the rook on e6. One-legged parrot says black could play after a5, c5. Actually, I'm not sure about this. Let's say knight b4, a5, c5, with the idea knight c6, bishop b8, bishop c7 to attack this pawn on a5. It just feels like it takes so much time. So I don't know. Maybe it's doable. Like, let's say we can't go bishop d2 yet. So what to do? It's just such a shame to give up the d5 square. But okay, I mean, a pawn is a pawn. I see black's point. So what to do? Maybe white defends with rook a3. Let's say we go back, bishop d2, knight c6, and then queen a1. And I'm not really sure, to be honest. I mean, it looks passive for white, but black is also passive. And I mean, white has a lot of strategic potential now that we've given away the d5 square, whereas the d4 square is not as useful. Yeah, I don't know. One day we're just going to be left with these dark squared bishops, and it won't be clear whose bishop is worse. But probably it'll be our bishop that's worse. Or maybe white tries to set up some b4 here. It's possible, but it feels shaky for black. I really prefer just taking the square myself and just fixing this knight on b4. You get to play c6, d5. To me, it just feels like more of a direct game. But thankfully, he didn't play a5 here and kind of fix the queen side. He played bishop e3. And now I realized, what I needed to do. So I take on e3. He goes f takes e3 and a5. So I'm finally in time. If rook takes e3, I would have probably played a5 anyway. With similar ideas. But I understand why white takes fe3 because, well, he's covering the d4 square, most importantly, but also f4. And now he opens up the f-file for the rook, so it kind of looks semi-dangerous. Rook f1, knight h4, he has this open f-file. This is not always so pleasant to deal with. But it's not really enough here for white, I think, after a5. Rook f1, knight b4. So now, well, my plan is pretty simple. I want to go c6, d5, or maybe queen c7, rook d8 first. Just build up the central pressure. If he goes knight f5 here, for example, I think I can just immediately play g6, and there's just no follow-up, so the knight has to go back. So this isn't really scary. During the game, I was mainly considering knight h4 here from white, and I was thinking about playing g6 here, but actually this is not such a great move here after d4, where maybe the center gets a little shaky, and now the f-file is kind of hanging, and this is dangerous. White is potentially threatening d5, and then I have to be careful with the knight on f6 after like queen f3, and then some knight f5 check. So this is actually probably good for white. Instead, black should make like a prophylactic move, like rook e8. Just getting out of the way first, and then if any knight comes to f5, then we'll play g6. And here black is doing all right. Or maybe this knight and g6 anyway. Or if white goes knight h5, we can trade, queen takes, threatening the f7 pawn, but black has a really nice move, queen g5. So threatening the queen takes f7 doesn't really work after queen takes h4, but we're also threatening the d3 pawn. So this knight on b4 is huge. Oh, why not play knight takes e4? Yeah, that's a good question. Knight e4 I think is unclear after knight h4 because f7 will be hanging at the end. So knight takes e4, queen takes, and rook takes f7. So this felt like a problem with just everything hanging. Knight on e4 now really strong. White's rook on f7 is good. Just felt very risky. Why not just push d4 right away for white? Yeah, this was also a move I was considering. D4 is kind of possible. I could take on d4 and take on e4. I wasn't sure about this during the game, but I think black is actually getting away with this. If, let's say, takes and queen b1, like pinning the rook, then I think we can go like f5 here, and we're okay. Maybe d5. No, d5, knight d2 is not so clear. So yeah, probably f5. I'm not sure if I would have taken the pawn. I think after d4 I can also play a move like rook back to e8, let's say. And I don't think white really gets a whole lot with the push, and black is still pretty solid. And yeah, white always has to worry about this e4 pawn now. I think I was also looking at, yeah, ed4 was the main line here. So d4 is possible, but it's not clear whether or not white is actually getting enough here. So yeah, take, queen b1, f5, knight d2, rook takes d4, take on f5, king h8. And looks like black is up a pawn. White has some potential threats, but maybe it's really not enough. Like, black's pieces just come back to the game very quickly, and it looks like white, yeah, just doesn't get enough for the pawn here. So d4, not an easy move to play. I think white has to take on e4, or not take on e4, I should say, just play queen b1 first, so that f5 is not possible here, and then black goes d5, and it's seems like a mess, rook e1, king somewhere, but I think black is okay. Like, c takes d5, queen is coming in. So, okay, instead what happened was he played queen e2. Here he actually offered a draw, which I was not unhappy to hear. I felt like black is comfortable. I didn't really think I was better, but I thought I was fine because I have a plan to play like c6 and d5. But yeah, it's not like black is doing all that great. Like, if I play c6 here, I think white can play d4. And it's not obvious at all that black is really pushing for anything here. I think white should be more or less fine. Black is also fine. I don't think white can get anything serious on the f-file or anything like that. So to me, it felt like about equal anyway, and yeah, I was definitely feeling pretty tired after this tournament. So I took the draw, called it a day, and that was that. Still an interesting game. I felt like it wasn't such a waste because the opening and the middle game I thought was pretty interesting, and I hadn't seen this c4 idea before, so this was kind of useful for me if I'm going to be like repeating to play this type of position. So yeah, overall I finished with 4.5 points out of 9. The average rating of the tournament was 2410, which means that basically it was I performed just right as expected. Like, average rating was very similar to my rating, and I scored even. So I think rating wise I'm not gaining anything, and I think the organizer told me I was losing like 0.3 points. So that was kind of a bummer. You never want to lose 0.3 rating points, but what are you going to do? For the norm, I would have needed to score 7 points out of 9 in this event. So yeah, but I feel like, I left some points on the table in this tournament. I mean, in round 1, I essentially missed one move where it just taking the game from a draw into a win. So I think I very much gave up a half point there. In round 2, I also had some huge chances. It's not a guarantee I would have won the game had I changed one move or something, but it was definitely very close. Round 3 and round 4, I'll call it a wash, because in round 3 this was the first game I lost with the opposite sides castling, and I definitely had an excellent position out of the opening, and I was like objectively close to winning, but I messed it up and lost the game. And in the following round, objectively I had a lost position out of the opening, but then my opponent messed it up and I ended up winning, I would say, quite a fortunate game. So those two kind of cancel each other out. I should have won the third game and lost the fourth game rather than vice versa. But then I dropped another half point against Grandmaster GM Megami. This was the game I covered yesterday, for those of you that were there. Hey, thanks Anu Pokrel for checking out the stream. All the best. So yeah, in the game I showed yesterday, I think was winning up until move 40, and then on move 40 I made a move that essentially let most of my advantage slip. And it was still good after that, but not nearly as good, and essentially the draw was virtually guaranteed. So that was another half point I think I kind of gave up, because almost any other reasonable move in that position was winning for black. And then, of course, the big miss was the game against Mishra, because in this game I had excellent opening preparation and essentially had a winning position out of the opening. I made a very bad miscalculation, just essentially blundering the game, and just got like a losing advantage just one or two moves after being just crushing in the opening. So that was a real bummer, and I felt like I really should have played better and won that game. Then I don't know. I mean, the previous game against Fear, as you guys saw, I won the game, but I think it was a pretty fortunate win. I can't say I really deserved to win that game. And then the two draws I made against Melik and Andronic, I think were pretty fair. But yeah, maybe I could have scored 2 more points if everything had gone right, and I would get 6.5, and it's still half a point short of the norm. So it's tough. It's really tough. Why do they make norms so hard to get? Well, yeah, you need a 2600 performance. That's not easy. No one scored a norm in the tournament, not even the GMs. The top score was 6 points. There was 2 players with 6, Grandmaster Gaim Magami and International Master Christopher Yu. No one got 7. Mishra did get an International Master norm, his second, so he ended up with, I think, 5.5 points, and he only needed 5 points for his IM norm. So congratulations to him. I'm sure we'll be seeing much more of Abhimanyu Mishra in the future. He's a really talented kid. No JD, no norms for me, not yet. But okay, I'm still working. My next tournament is going to be the Spice Cup in St. Louis, which starts in about 3 weeks. So I'm just going to be working hard. Looking at a lot of my openings, trying to play a lot more training games, and staying fresh. Okay, at first glance, One-Legged Parrot says, I would guess you have trouble calculating lines. I think in this tournament, most of my mistakes were just calculation errors, which was a bit unfortunate, but I hadn't played in a while, and so I guess I just wasn't in such great form. I mean, somehow I performed at 2400 level, but some of the mistakes I made, for those of you guys that saw, were pretty bad. I mean, compared to the lines that I'm usually able to calculate, the mistakes I was making, I think were of a pretty low level. So yeah, I have to think about it a little bit more, but it felt like, I was just like losing focus at certain moments. I mean, 2 moments that really bother me, of course, were missing the win against Grandmaster Hassan a few rounds ago, where I had a pretty good chance and I just blew it. And then, of course, against Mishra, kind of miscounting and blundering. That was pretty bad as well. Had I not done that, I might have 1.5 more points in the tournament. Had I changed those 2 moves.